Hello and good afternoon. Today I'd like to start a series that I've been trying to do for months and months. But I was trying to do something a little too elaborate and cover all sorts of scenarios and permutations and possible errors, and that's a never-ending battle. So today I'm just going to keep it simple, and I am going to start a process whereby I go through the AL for Beginners workbook and walk through each section and complete everything. You'll see what I do, and you can replicate it and follow along with the workbook, and we will learn the basics of Business Central AL development. So let's get started here. Oh, wrong direction. Okay, technical failure. So I was trying to see if I could grab a stock photo or some image for programming or coding, and I just thought this was funny. So here's an image of a coder, as it's called in the stock image site, and I can't tell if he's concentrating or praying. And if you've done software development, a prayer is sometimes appropriate. So this might be a pre-compile prayer. And then what's especially funny is the photo description. Photo of serious coder interested in critical errors and failures arising, remaining unknown until he started coding scripts by using Java language. Very bizarre. Some strange translation there, but anyway, I thought that was hilarious. I took that as a developer who's praying in front of his 4 monitors and plus laptop. And then a second one I thought that was funny. Here we have the hipster or lumberjack or something in the plaid shirt, and he's in a Zen moment. And so apparently meditation has something to do with coding. So I thought that was funny, but I gave up on trying to find a photo after that and just went with the matrix theme, because that's what it's like learning a new language. I'm staring at the matrix trying to figure out what it means. But so with that, this is what we'll be working on. This is the Programming in AL for Beginners workbook by Christoph. I believe I'm saying that correctly, or you can just say Chris. And I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name because I will say it wrong. And he is on Twitter as MyNavBlog, and he prepared this workbook a while back. Gosh, I'm guessing 8-9 months ago or so, prior to prior to December 2019. And I was very excited when I saw this. It's fantastic. It's free. It covers all of your basics of getting started, just simple scenarios, everything from setting up your workstation to creating a project, doing a little bit of AL development, and getting started. So it'll take you to the basics where you are then ready to try to figure out how to start your own development. So great intro, and we're going to walk through it in multiple sections. The chapters are a different length, so I'll have to see how to break those up, but the first chapter is about setting up your development environment. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so let me switch over to my development environment. So this is a Windows server, and this is a VM. So here I have a pretty vanilla Windows Server 2019 machine. I prefer to use Windows Server as a development tool for historical reasons based on the development that I've done. But I'm told that Windows 10 is perfectly acceptable. I've also chosen Windows Server in order to use Docker Engine Enterprise, I believe. And I don't know if that's still the case, but back when I first started working with Docker, I chose that so that Docker could run as a Windows service and not as a desktop application or agent that required a user session in Windows. And I haven't extensively researched that, but at the time I tried Docker on Windows 10 and it seemed like I had to be logged in on the machine in order to use it. I wanted to ultimately have the ability to have a server running Docker as a Windows service such that I could access those Docker containers and images and manage it remotely without having to be logged onto the machine. That was my rationale. I don't know if it's valid. You know, grain of salt with anything I say. And if there are different ways to do things, definitely check that out. Figure out what works for you. This was my kind of thought at the time, and I've just stuck with it because it's easier than trying to figure out all the permutations. So his workbook, AL for Beginners workbook, does talk through the process of more of a Windows 10 and Docker desktop situation. So you can go that direction. This is one area where I'm going to deviate, and I have Server 2019, so I'm going to go with Enterprise, Docker Engine Enterprise. But before I start, I will point out something here. So I clicked on the Start menu, I typed WinVer, W-I-N-V-E-R, pressed Enter, and it brings up the About Windows, and it shows you the Windows version. The reason I mention this is because the Windows version is pretty important with both Docker and with the Business Central Docker images. Apparently, there's some real sensitivity to the specific Windows build when you're working with Docker. So when you have an image, that image ideally should be the exact same build as the Windows host that it's running on. That's my understanding. So you want to do a couple things. One, make sure you're on Windows 1809, version 1809 or higher. I believe, at least last time I downloaded Windows Server, the latest build was just version 1809. Windows 10, I think they have a newer version, like 1903 or something like that. So download the latest version you can, and then make sure to run Windows Update and make sure everything is updated thoroughly, that you're on the latest build. You'll want to look at the last 4 digits. Like in my case, this is 17763.1339. So if you have a .100 something or 200 something, you'll definitely want to be over 1,000 in my experience. So I have a slightly older version. It's in the 1200s. This I just patched today, and it's showing 1339. So make sure that you are on a 1,000 plus build. I don't know exactly what all the version numbers are, the build numbers are, but make sure you're in the latest build whenever possible. And when Windows doesn't update and it increments this build number, that is going to affect your Docker images. So if you had images built for version or build 1200 of Windows, when you update to this 1339, you will ideally want to clean out all of your containers and images and rebuild from scratch, download new images for this 1339 build, and create new containers. So we'll talk about that once I try to do a build or build a container. So with that, this is my Windows server. It is a virtual machine running on a Hyper-V server, and that has worked perfectly fine for me. I originally thought that I needed to have the host on bare metal hardware. I did try that. That works perfectly fine as well, but I have since tried running Docker in a VM. It's worked perfectly fine for me so far for the very simple learning that I've been doing. More advanced scenarios, maybe it won't work as well, but for this project, the AL for Beginners workbook, this project, it'll work perfectly fine. Okay, so with that, where do we start? Well, you can open up a browser, and I'll just reproduce this, and you can Google GitHub AL for Beginners. And beginners, and not BitHub, GitHub. Okay, so there'll be a couple results here. I'm showing it as the second one on Google, but that'll vary depending on where you're at and how Google behaves. You want my nav blog AL for Beginners, You'll click on that GitHub link, and you'll notice Christoph's name here. MyNavBlog is his repository, AL for Beginners. And you'll see a couple folders here, and the third item in this list is Programming in AL for Beginners.pdf. So you can click on that, and it'll open up in the browser in this little control, but I personally prefer to download the file. So you can click on the download button here, and it downloads, and you can then open it. Now, I've already downloaded that, and when I open it in the browser, I've already got the PDF here. So you can print this out, which he does, fully encourage in the workbook. Print this out, have a copy. It's 100 some pages, so actually it's exactly 100 pages, looks like. So it does consume a little bit of paper, but go double-sided, 50 pages, and you can also print a couple of chapters at a time and just work through those if you like the paper thing and take notes and mark them up. So that's why he calls it a workbook. And just see how things are going. Okay, so programming in AL for beginners. Let me just make this a little bigger and get my head out of the way. Oops, there we go. So scroll down to the table of contents. So introduction, preparing the development environment, and several other chapters. We're just going to focus on today preparing the development environment. Okay. So I'm going to scroll down, and a few steps involved in this. Come on, keep hitting the wrong button. Visual Studio Code, extensions for the AL language, set up development database using Docker container, or directly in an online sandbox. I'm going to work on the Docker container. Install Git for source control and create a repository in Azure DevOps. I may skip that step because that requires the Azure account and I'd have to deal with the login and setup. So you can follow along, but that's kind of secondary. The biggest hurdles I have found for people who are trying to get into AL development on Docker, it's really getting the Docker container set up and then using NAVContainerHelper and understanding that scripting process. So that's where we're going to focus today. So he starts out by providing instructions around Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code is the development tool for AL language for Business Central development. So let's get started with that. Installation. To perform or to install Visual Studio Code, you'll go to code.visualstudio.com. You'll download the latest version for your platform or your OS because it is multi-platform, Mac, Windows, and I think Linux. I'm obviously using Windows, so that's all I care about. So you can go here and you can download the stable build for your platform. Now, I've already done that. So I'm just going to open my downloads folder. And here is my VS Code user setup 1.47.2. And I'm going to double click on this. And this will probably be very routine, should be very routine, next type of thing. And let me just scroll down to that page and get back where I was. Okay, so accept, next, great. And sure, let's have a desktop icon. And let's do an open with code on directory. I think that's kind of handy. Visual Studio Code, I'm used to full Visual Studio. Visual Studio Code feels very different if you're used to a full Visual Studio. It operates very much on like a folder basis and a file system basis. It's not structured with a solution file that contains all the metadata. So it's a very different experience for me. So I have found that I want to open the directory in VS Code when I open a project, since I don't think there's the equivalent of solution files or project files. So let's just do open with code for file as well. And add path, fine. I don't know about the supported file types. I'll just leave that blank for now. And the reason I point out those options is because when I've tried to change those in the past, there's no easy way to enable that after the fact. If you want to be able to have those context menus to open a directory from within code, you have to uninstall and reinstall. So that's no fun. It's not hard. It only takes a few minutes, but it's kind of like, ugh, I don't want to deal with that. So I would recommend paying close attention to those options when you do the initial install, just to save yourself some time. So it's going to do its thing. And while we're waiting for that, let's just go back here. Oops, I skipped too far. Let's go back up. Wow, I really skipped too far. Okay, so download and install the current version. After it installs, open code, go to extensions management. Okay, so launch Visual Studio and we will finish. Let me minimize this. And there we go. Great. So this is Visual Studio Code. It feels much more minimalist than Visual Studio to me. It's very stripped down, very simple seeming. I think almost all the same features are there, but the organization is very different. So even though I've used Visual Studio forever, this is a completely different environment and I feel like I don't know how to do anything. So I'm starting from scratch completely here with VS Code as well. I've slowly figured out what a few things mean, but I'm just not used to the navigation as much. Okay, so after we've installed it, open it and go to Extensions Management and find the AL language. Now, I stared at this for several minutes saying, where is Extension Management? He doesn't explicitly mention this. And like I said, I don't know how to use VS Code. Turns out that Extension Management is this guy here over this like blocky thing like Tetris over on the left edge. So I will click on that. That opens the extensions sidebar here. And he says, find the AL language and install it. Okay, so let's do that. So let's do AL language. And there we are. So it's right at the top of our search result list, and it is by Microsoft, 94,000 downloads. And I'm going to click on the little install button here, and it is installing. So while that's installed, there are lots of extensions that you can use and probably will want to use in VS Code when developing AL. I'm aware of many of them. I haven't used them enough to be familiar with them yet, but it seems that most of the AL developers will install multiple extensions in order to make their life easier when they develop AL. So you will see right below AL language, Waldo CRS AL language extensions. And so this is one that you may want to consider. Okay, so looks like that got installed. So we'll start basic, and if it calls for other extensions, we can install those. But I'll just follow the instructions explicitly so I don't deviate too much, and we'll see how that goes. Great, so we've installed it. Okay. So he points out that VS Code lets you extend it. You can have many extensions, and he mentions some of those additional extensions. AZAL Dev Tools, that's quite an incredible extension with a bunch of different features, so that's one to check out. As I mentioned, Waldo CRS AL language extension, AL Variable Helper, AL Object Designer. Now, Waldo has also assembled an extension pack. And let me see if it shows up. Okay, there we go. So this is called, how do I get rid of this? Okay. This is the AL extension pack by Waldo. And what he has done is collected lots of different extensions that he likes to use. So rather than installing all 22 of these individually, he's assembled them in one pile so that you can click install and install them all at once. And while that may be beneficial once you're familiar with them and want to use all of them, it may be a little overwhelming at first. So I'm going to hold off on that, because once you install all of them, you'll get all this functionality lit up and you won't necessarily know which extension is doing what, and it may be a little confusing. But just wanted to let you know about that. In addition to these 4 that Christoph lists here, you may want to eventually consider the AL extension pack by Waldo. So, great. We have Visual Studio Code installed. We have AL language extension installed. So we're just going to move on. Now comes Docker. And Docker and the related tool NAVContainerHelper, in my limited experience, these are the big hurdles that most new developers, AL developers, will run into. So let's take a look at that. So Docker allows you to create local development environments. Each environment is separated and packed in something called a container. Thanks to that, you can have more than one installation of Business Central on your computer. So my simple mind, I think of it very much like virtual machines. So I have a Hyper-V server. It can run multiple virtual machines. Now, the architecture of Docker is very different, operates differently, you manage it differently, but in essence, for our purposes, it's kind of the same. I can have a Business Central container. It's not a virtual machine, it's just a container. But when I access that container, it shows up like its own machine or its own server. I can interact with Business Central on that machine. We'll call it BC1. And I can have a BC2 with a different configuration, different development tools, different extensions installed, even different locality and language. So I can have BC1, BC2, BC test, BC blue, whatever you want to call them. You can have multiple containers running. And then each of those containers is based upon an image. So the image is the underlying OS and Business Central image that provides all of the OS infrastructure and Business Central server infrastructure required. And that gets exposed in a container, which I think of as like an instance. So we have our base image, and if I want to use that image, I create an instance of it that is called a container. And I'm sure there's better terminology for this, but that's how I think about it. It's very much effectively like Hyper-V as far as I'm concerned. It's just called a Docker container. The Docker container is based off of a Docker image. And there's other technicalities related to Docker and NAVContainerHelper, but we'll get to that later. So let's install Docker. So this is an area where I mentioned I'm going to deviate. This says go to docker.com and get started. You download it and install it. That's how you would do it with, say, a Windows 10 installation, and you would install Docker Desktop, and I've seen reports it works perfectly fine. I tried that. I wanted more the Windows service approach so that I could just manage it from the command line, have no UI, not have to be logged in, and I think that is a case for Docker Enterprise, or Engine Enterprise, I think they call it. So I'm going to deviate a little bit, and I'm going to open this text file where I took some notes. So if you go to this URL, hubdocker.com editions enterprise Docker EE server for Windows, I'm just going to pull that up. This page has instructions for installing Docker Engine Enterprise on Windows Server 2019 and 2016. And I don't know how long this is going to be available or how long this documentation is going to be up, if this is like a community version, but Docker was acquired by a company and the whole Docker Enterprise licensing and usage changed. So I don't know if that's going to affect the long-term use of Docker Enterprise for free. But here you see Docker Enterprise is available at no additional cost for Windows Server 2019 and 2016 customers. Technical support is aligned as support entitlement from Microsoft. But due to the acquisition of Docker by a company, I don't know if this is still applicable. This page might be old and might go away. But for now, I'm going to go with it. So back to this. That page does have instructions. I've just copied it out. It gives you some background and featured benefits, installation, and testing. So I've just copied those lines, those installation lines here. So in order to install Docker Enterprise, and in order to really manage and use Docker, you're going to need to use a little bit of PowerShell. Now, if you're concerned about that, don't worry. I had never used PowerShell until a few months ago. I didn't want to have to learn it, and it's kind of like DOS. You only need to know a handful of commands. It's not that complex, so let's give it a try. So I'm just going to copy this command. I'm going to go down bottom of my server here. I have this PowerShell icon, this blue icon with this caret style prompt, and I'm going to paste in this command. Install -module docker msft provider -force. No idea what this is. It's a Docker Microsoft provider, and hit enter. And okay, cool. Potential issue. So it's good that we run into these errors so that you understand when you run into them. Administrator rights are required to install modules. Great. So let's just close this. I am just going to right click on my icon. I'm going to right click on PowerShell, and instead of doing run as administrator, because I'll have to do that every time, I'm going to go into properties for that icon, click on advanced, and I'm going to check the box run as administrator. Click on OK. Now I think, okay, sometimes some icons have compatibility tab, and you can choose always run as administrator. This one appears to be under advanced here. So great, now that I've done that, I'm going to click, and I'm going to be prompted to run as an administrator. I'm going to say yes. Great. So now I'm going to paste in my command, install -module docker Microsoft provider -force. Fingers crossed. I didn't pre-test all of this because then I'd have to uninstall it. So I'm kind of running this on the fly here. So let's see what happens. This should be fairly quick. And let's see what Windows is doing. Okay. Interesting. So this is like a live demo. PowerShell get requires NuGet provider. And okay, great. So NuGet must be available, but it's kind of nice. Do you want PowerShell to install and import the NuGet provider now? Well, we need it, so sure. So I'm going to type yes and enter. And it did some little download bit. And let's see what happens. And the downside to live streaming is I can't just trim this out and fast forward, but I will gab. So there we go. So we're back at a C prompt in PowerShell, or PowerShell command prompt, and it looks like it's done. So now I'm going to go back to Notepad here, and I'm going to do the second line. And this is install package docker, provider name docker Microsoft provider force. I don't know what the syntax means. I haven't really looked into install module or install package. You only need to use it for this and NAVContainerHelper. So I just do what the documentation says. It's worked fine. If you're curious and want to learn more, definitely check out the documentation. Pasting it in, hit enter. So this is essentially installing Docker and Docker Enterprise Edition, Docker Engine Enterprise. Okay. So we're getting some warnings here. And one note about Docker, do not ignore warnings, whether it's a direct Docker command, PowerShell command, or especially NAVContainerHelper. Look for warnings actively because they are really telling you something, and you will ignore them at your own peril because you'll wonder why something doesn't work, and invariably there's a warning in there telling you what the problem was. Okay, so it's saying version cannot be found on this object, properties cannot be found, and I'm assuming the -force is pushing past these warnings. So let's see what happens here. Okay, some waiting. So this might be go make some coffee or tea, stretch your legs. It's been a while since I've last done this. Now, while this is working, one concern I've seen, and I've seen Waldo mention it on Twitter and someone else. There we go. So you see Docker 19035. Docker versions. Once this gets installed, in my experience, Docker just kind of runs. And it, as far as I know, at least Docker Enterprise, it does not update automatically. It doesn't prompt you to update, even though new versions are released. So you might be tempted, like, oh, I see I have 1903.5 and there's a new 1903.7 available. Let me just go ahead and update. Well, I don't know about Enterprise Edition, but on the Desktop Edition, apparently that is potentially problematic. And Waldo and a few others have done that, and it apparently has caused serious issues. I don't recall what those issues are, but kind of, navigating this process and seeing the warnings of others, I'm a little leery about updating. And if you're using Docker Desktop, you might want to be particularly leery and maybe do it on a throwaway machine and don't do this in the middle of a critical time. So, okay, so we now have Docker Engine Enterprise for use with Windows Server. Very cool. So is that easy? You don't really have to know anything. You just need to know how to launch PowerShell using run as admin. You need to know how to copy and paste from this website. And voila, a couple minutes later, we now have Docker Enterprise. And let's just go take a look and see what that looks like. I'm going to type services, and there's our services app. Okay, and so let's see if it shows up as a service. Great. So there we are, Docker Engine. Startup type is automatic. It is not started. So if you're running into issues, that might explain why. So now that we have Docker installed, let's try a command. I'm just going to type Docker, see what happens. And, oh, okay, great. So we at least got a kind of like a help response. So Docker, self-sufficient runtime for containers, and there's all sorts of options here. So let's see. We have a command here called Docker PS, list containers. And then there's all sorts of others. Docker RM, remove containers. RMI, remove images. Run. So start and stop, or there's stop. There's start. Okay, so start and stop will be commands. And I have a separate video on Docker commands that I use. So check out my YouTube channel or Twitch channel, and you should see a video there recently about Docker commands that I use. So great, Docker works. So let's do Docker PS. Error connecting to the Docker engine. Makes sense because the Windows service is not running. So let's right click on the Windows service. Sorry, my nose itches. Windows could not start the Docker engine service on local. Okay, so I may have to do some live troubleshooting and hopefully I can get through this. So let's, and this is good because many people will go through the Docker setup process for BC and they'll say, that's easy. It installed fine. I had no issues. What's your problem? Meanwhile, you're running into problem after problem, kind of like I did when I first tried this. So it's kind of good we have problems. So I installed Docker Enterprise. Looks good, but it's not started and it is failing to start. So let's see what we see here. So, cannot find the file specified, pipe Docker engine. Oh, in the default daemon configuration, the Docker client must run elevated to connect. This error may indicate the Docker daemon is not running. So that's correct. Our Windows service is not running. We tried to start it, couldn't start up. Let's take a look and see if we have an error. Okay. Failed to start daemon, failed to load VM compute DLL, ensure the containers feature is installed. Let's just Google that. So I'm going to open a new tab and Docker. Okay. Docker for Win issues. Okay. 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 So maybe a reboot. Turning it off and on again. Okay. So I don't know what this is. This sounds intriguing. Ensure that the containers feature is installed. Docker EE. Let's just go down that route. Docker not work in Hyper-V 2019. Okay. Okay. And I know I had this working fine on Windows 2019 Hyper-V. Oh, so containers feature, ensure it's installed. So this sounds interesting. Set service HNS. Okay, so we need hypervisor platform, virtual machine platform. Okay. So I see I have Hyper-V. Let's just give this, oh, nope, still no go. Yeah, good times. Hope I don't have to bail on this and figure out how to fix this. Huh. Okay. Okay, so let's try a couple things. We have Docker. Where'd it go? Docker engine. Let's just see if there's anything else in here. Starting up, we have our error. Failed to load VM compute. Make sure containers feature is installed. Fault bucket. Windows error. PowerShell. Okay. Okay. Well, this looked promising. Let's see what this does. Hypervisor platform. Rather than doing command line, I'm just going to use the UI. Could be that I don't have something installed. I'm going to go to Tools. Actually, local server. And what is going on? Computer management. Manage. Okay, add roles and features. Role-based. Dev01. Okay, so Hyper-V is not installed. Oh, destination has a pending restart. Okay, so let's give that a try. Let me just close down this stuff. I don't need that. I don't think I need anything else. Let's close down. I don't know what the pending restart is from, if that's from the Docker EE. Okay. Okay, restart. And little intermission here. Dev01, where are you? Still rebooting. So this is what you should expect. If you get everything to complete perfectly, you are very fortunate, and do not get complacent about that. Just because it worked perfectly for you the first time and you didn't have any problems, they're bound to happen eventually. Oh, okay, so it's installing something else. It's part of the reboot. There we go. Okay, fingers crossed. Let's see what happens here. Okay, and place your bets. Docker engine is not running. Well, I may have to bail on this and figure out what the problem is. Okay, Windows log. Come on. And you may have problems with the Docker install, Docker startup, Docker configuration, Docker networking. So many variables, I don't even know where to start. Now, we're not getting an error. Is it still just trying to start up? Look at that. Okay. I wasn't as patient. So it says running. So, interesting. After install, I'm pretty sure I had a reboot prior to starting the stream. So something required a reboot, and that may have been the Docker Enterprise install or those Docker module install. I'm not sure. But after the reboot, now things are activated. It took 30 seconds for a Docker engine to start up, so be a little patient on that first reboot. So that's a good lesson. After installing Docker EE, do a reboot, and then wait patiently for it to start up. And that's good because we're not seeing any errors here. So API listen, we've got daemon as completed installation. Very cool. Okay, so now that we are running, our Docker engine service is running. And I think I saw, come to think of it, I think I saw a way to have Docker desktop run as a service, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're running on Windows 10 and you use Docker desktop, maybe there is a way to have it run as a service. I have not looked into that. Too many variables and permutations. So here's my PowerShell prompt, run as administrator, Docker PS. Yes, okay. And then another command, Docker PS A. So a Docker PS command won't show stopped containers. Docker PS-A will show all containers. So I've got nothing. Great. Another command to know is Docker images. Instead of doing Docker containers, they did Docker PS, whereas images is just Docker images. And same thing, Docker images-A. So we have a clean slate. We now have Docker Engine Enterprise running. Cool. I'm going to clear that out. Now, let's go back to AL for Beginners Workbook. Excellent. So, after that reboot, we have install VS Code, which we did, Docker and local development environment. Okay, so When you install Docker Desktop, one thing you definitely need to do is switch to Linux containers. Switch to Windows containers. If you see switch to Windows containers, you need to switch. If you see switch to Linux containers, you're already running in the Windows container mode and you're perfectly fine. Now, I swear I had an issue where I switched to Windows containers, rebooted or something, and it switched back to Linux containers. And that took me a couple hours to figure out. But so something to pay attention there is make sure that you are using the Windows container version, not the Linux container version. So now that we have Docker set up, create your first Business Central container. And that involves NAVContainerHelper. So you can go to github.com, Microsoft NAVContainerHelper, and Freddie has lots of resources on that GitHub repository, documentation, the versions, issue submissions. I'm just going to kind of skip forward to the commands I use to save time, but this is a sample script that was relevant back when this document was created. As of July 2020, you'll want to use a slightly different technique, which I'll walk through here. And that is one caveat. Everything I say here, it may change in a couple months. So that is one challenge of documenting all this. As of July 2020, I'm going to use a different method. And this is my NAVContainerHelper note. Let me minimize this. Okay, so I'm going to use this command, get installed module. And this is a PowerShell command to let you see which modules you have installed. And this takes a little bit for some reason. Okay, so we see that Docker Microsoft provider, which makes sense. That was the module we installed previously. Very cool. So now if you want to see if you have NAVContainerHelper installed, I believe you can just do this, NAVContainerHelper. I don't think it's case sensitive. Okay, no match was found. Great. Now, I have this other version in case you're interested. Get installed module -name NAVContainerHelper -all versions. And the all versions is kind of helpful. It is possible to unknowingly install multiple versions of NAVContainerHelper. And you do not want to do that. You want to have one version and only the latest version. So I reran this command, no match was found. Fine. So presumably we do not have it installed. So I'm going to install module NAVContainerHelper. And you don't need to go download anything. You just do this and it knows to go look in the PowerShell module repository and download and install it. You're installing this from an untrusted repository. If you trust it, it'll change this policy. I'm going to say yes. Installing from PS Gallery. So it automatically knows where to find this, downloads and installs it for you. Okay. Okay, great. So that installed, and I didn't write down one command. I'm just grabbing it from my blog here. So let me open a browser tab. And so my blog is blog.steveendo.com. And I'm pulling up one of my own articles. I often write articles just so I have notes of what I did here. And this is related to the New-BcContainerWizard. And this is as of July 10th when I wrote this. So July, you'll want to start using this. And basically, okay, so let me just go up. This was a side conversation that I had. So I'm just going to have this command New-BcContainerWizard. I'm going to save that there. That's what I was looking for. So I ran the install module NAVContainerHelper. Now I'm going to import module NAVContainerHelper. And I have not yet taken the time to understand install module versus import module. I just know that when I'm in a PowerShell session, in the past, I've needed to run import module to get it active in this session so that I can use NAVContainerHelper. So it's going to import this module into this session. That's my interpretation of it. Warning, some of the commands include unapproved verbs. So that's okay. It's just a warning. Just be aware of it. Great. So now that I have that, I'm going to run New-BcContainerWizard. So back in the day, you kind of had to understand what to do with NAVContainerHelper, this utility that helps you create a Business Central container. Let's see, how long have we been going on here? Don't want to go on too long. So almost an hour. So hopefully we wrap this up soon. You had to install and import the module. You had to define these variables. You had to have this script to understand, okay, I need to have this script to call these parameters and set this up. And I didn't know what these meant. There was documentation on each, but I didn't really know what I was doing. So this script was kind of like this sacred thing that I cherished, and I had my version that I kind of knew worked, and I didn't want to deviate. You no longer have to know that. Freddie has thought about this problem for new users, and he has created a new tool called New-BcContainerWizard. So I'm just going to paste that in. And this nice utility is literally a step-by-step wizard. It steps you through the process of, okay, let me help you build a new container. Accept EULA. Of course, we want to accept the EULA without reading it. Local or Azure VM. Are you going to run this locally on a machine in your Docker container? Or are you going to run this Docker container in an Azure VM? Oops, I'm sorry. I'm not showing the monitor properly. Sorry about that. So catching you up, I ran these commands: install module NAVContainerHelper, import module NAVContainerHelper, and then I went over my blog to the New-BcContainerWizard article, and I just grabbed this command, New-BcContainerWizard. So sorry about that. This whole live streaming thing, hit the wrong button. So now let me just start this over so you see it from scratch. So New-BcContainerWizard, and this is a wizard that steps you through the entire process of helping you use NAVContainerHelper. And I have a video on this as well, so you can check that out. And we want to accept the EULA and local or Azure VM. I want a local Docker container, and I can type A, or I can just press enter to accept the default. What type of authentication? And for now, I found username password authentication is the simplest. You can try other methods and experiment with them. As I mentioned in my other video, one thing about Windows authentication you want to be careful with, you cannot be logged into Windows using the administrator account, and your Windows password must meet the typical complexity requirements. So minimum length, upper lower case characters combined, you must have symbols and numbers. So it must meet the minimum complexity. Now, I'm going to go with B for simplicity here. Just hit enter. But if you're using Windows, just be careful of that. Okay, enter the name of the container. I'm going to call this test1. Well, let's just go with test for now. Short lowercase names as container names. I would agree. So you can do an exclamation point to accept default answers for the remaining questions, and X to start over, Z to go back. I'm just going to do test. Latest Business Central Sandbox. You have the alternative of having the latest sandbox, which is SaaS, on-prem version, or you can choose specific builds. So if you want a 16.2, 16.0, a 15 version, you can do that. I'm just going to go with the latest. And then, which country version do you want to use? I'm going to go with default of US. And if you want the international, I think it's called, you can use W1. Let's do US. Do you need the test toolkit to be installed? This is if you're going to be doing the automated testing routines and have those libraries installed. It's not a big deal, but it does take a little more time to get those downloaded and installed. So I'm going to skip that and choose the default of D. And let's see, do I want to assign the premium plan? For now, I'm going to say no. Do I want test users with special entitlements? I'm going to say no because I want to skip the license file for now. And this is if you want to have a license file. I'm going to leave this blank. Okay, database. Do you want Cronus demo database with SQL Express? Sure. Okay. And use DNS, default settings, or do you want to use your host's primary DNS? I'm going to use my host DNS because I use a Pi-hole DNS server, and I want that for slightly better security and control. But you can go with the default, or you can use the Google DNS settings. And that may be one area you may run into issues and may need to create a new container. So you may need to try settings depending on your environment. I'm going to let NAVContainerHelper figure out the appropriate isolation mode. How much memory? Blank means no limit. I'm going to go with blank. So let's give that a try. And this is an option to save an image. So I chose to use the latest sandbox version for my image and containers. And I chose the US locality. And I have this version of Windows. So that combination will produce an image specific to those combinations. Do I want to save that such that this script builds and saves that image for me? So if I want to do this again tomorrow, it saves time. So I'm going to give that a try. So I'm going to call this my BC image and press enter. So that wizard generates this script for me. So rather than having to know what my parameters are or use someone else's script, I can walk through the wizard and have all of these parameters set up for me. It's kind of nice. Now, once I have that script, I can just copy this and I can go into like PowerShell ISE or Notepad++, and I can paste it and I can save this. So I'm going to save this as New-BcContainer.ps. And there we go. Now, if I wanted to run that, I can open this PowerShell ISE, the kind of the teal or aqua icon at the bottom. And this is PowerShell ISE. It's what I found is a little easier to use. I'm going to click on Open Script button, go to my desktop, and PS1 shows what I know. Okay, PS1. Okay, and now New-BcContainer PS1. So now I have the script for NAVContainerHelper to create a New-BcContainer. I don't need to remember these. I don't need to write them down. I don't need to save this. It's no longer sacred. And now we're ready. So let's go back to the workbook and see what the next steps are. So the script for creating a container, here's a sample. And the first time you run it, it can take a long time. That is true. This can take 8 to 10 minutes for me. And I am on a 100 megabit fiber internet connection. If your internet connection is slower, this is going to take a while. I would not recommend running this on a wireless network unless you know your wireless network is really fast. If you're running this on a slow wireless network that's 15, 20 megabits per second, it's going to take quite a while. So I'd recommend a hardwire connection if at all possible. Plug your laptop in, plug your computer into a hardwire. It'll just be faster and more reliable. So I'm just going to kick this off and then wrap it up, and I'll resume where this left off. So I have my script here. I'm going to click on the green arrow. and okay. So I do not have permission to run Docker commands. Sound familiar? So I'm going to stop this and save it. I'm going to close this, and I don't think I had PowerShell ISE run as administrator. So I'm going to do that and go to Advanced, Run as Administrator. Okay, okay. Now I'm going to relaunch PowerShell ISE. And also, if you have corporate antivirus or malware protection, whatever it's called, running on a machine, it may block PowerShell. You may need to have that modified to allow you to use PowerShell in your corporate environment. So on my other machines, I use some anti-malware that blocks PowerShell completely. So on my desktop, I cannot use PowerShell. So I've relaunched using Run as Administrator. I'm going to hit the play button. And it is running. And so it's going to do its thing, kick off these scripts, and run these PowerShell modules. And you'll notice there's some download activity. I use a tool called NetSpeed Monitor that lets me see how much is being downloaded. And that will be relevant when you start downloading these images because they are huge. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here because this is going to take at least 8 to 10 minutes to download this 6 to 10 gig, whatever it is. It's a massive base image. And it's doing a couple things. It's going to download a generic image, and that is an image tied to a specific version or build of Windows OS. So there it goes. So it's kicking off that process, and you see it's downloading at 70 to 100 megabits per second. So this is going to take a while. Once it downloads that generic image for my OS, it's going to then download what's called an artifact. And that is a Business Central specific set of additional components that need to be installed for the parameters that I specified. So the latest build of the BC sandbox, the SAS sandbox, and with the options that I specified without the test tools, etc. So that's called the artifact. So first is the generic image, which is just the OS layer and core components that are shared across all versions of or builds that we're going to have. And then there's the artifacts, which are the BC version specific components that need to be installed additionally. And then it's going to combine those in an install in order to produce my named image that I specified here, which is, it's going to save an image called my BC image for me. So it's going to kick this off. Go ahead, walk away, go get some coffee, make some tea, have a snack. It's going to take probably at least 8 to 10 minutes. So with that, I will resume in the next session where this left off. Have a good one.